welcome back, everyone. So today we have our very first guest on this podcast, and she is a person I will say that is very near and dear to all of us. She is a former high school teacher and coach with over a decade of experience. She has a bachelor's degree in math and education, as well as a master's in education with a focus in library science. She is the founder of The Clear State, which is a business that specializes in spiritual response therapy, Akashic record clearings, and psychic readings. In addition to her SRT sessions, she also offers one-on-one transformational mentorships and has most recently released the Amor program, one that focuses on all things relationships with yourself and others. She's also an executive contributor to Brains Magazine. And on top of all that, she goes by the name DJ Socrates when she's dropping some sick tech house beats around the LA area. We all originally became introduced to her originally through SRT sessions, which I think I can speak for all of us, cracked us all wide open, really helped us make a lot of sense about a lot of lifelong traits that we've had and how we interact with others, as well as some insight into some significant past life stuff that we've had. Lexi, Mia, and I have also worked with Ashlee in her transformational mentorship. And transformation is an understatement of what can be accomplished in this space with her. So with that being said, we're going to dive right back into all things relationships, a topic that we started talking about a couple weeks ago. So I would like to introduce our mentor, our friend, our coven sister, Ashlee DiSalvo. So Ashlee, welcome to the Agitators podcast. We're thrilled to have you as our first guest. And so let's just dive right in. I think first off, what we should probably talk about is your new program that you just released. So do you want to talk a little bit about that and what people can kind of expect from that and what they can get out of that?
Sure. So thanks for having me, guys. This is the first time I've been on a podcast. So first, really excited and honored, and thanks for hyping me up. I realize how much I do until somebody else says it, and then it sounds so grandiose. So my Amori program, I wanted to create something to help my clients and just the general public with relationships. I have all this experience with coaching and teaching and being in people's lives. And I think the first time I started really wanting to help people with relationships was when I was teaching high school and coaching high school athletics. I seemed to become the middleman between parents and kids, as I think most teachers do. And, I was doing a lot of work myself. I was fresh out of a divorce. And so I thought back to this moment recently when I was in Hawaii for a month and just wanted to create something to help. Originally, honestly, the thought on my mind was like parents and kids. That was what I was looking for. That was what I was hoping for, because I don't provide my SRT services to children. So just providing something for the younger generation, because I have that relationship with a lot of kids that are 14, 15, 13 even. And then as I sat down and started channeling it and writing it, it became something that seemed more for the intimate relationships between adults. It just kind of flew through me. My intention was to help people understand their relationship with themselves so that they can better understand and maneuver their relationships with others. That was it. So it turned into something crazy and fun and interesting, and I don't know. I'm still figuring out what it is for myself. I used a lot of just my background with therapy and with coaching and with training and with my experiences, and I just hope that the public enjoys it as much as I think they will.
I think we watched the podcast episode that we talked about relationships last night, so we could refresh ourselves. And that was one of the notes that I took, was like relationships with others as a reflection of your relationship with yourself.
Always.
And I think like that is like one of the most pivotal things that like we've learned from our mentorship with you, and in like a wide variety of ways, not even necessarily that that's what we were trying to work on, but it's really amazing how when you're focused on yourself, that ripples out into your relationships with others. I mean, even this morning.
It's a powerful radical self-reliance and like radical responsibility is a really important thing that I started focusing on probably like 2 years after my divorce. I'd always, I mean, I've gone to therapy for a long time. I have some childhood trauma that has been the focus for me for a long time, and so that is just, you continuously drudge through that as an adult, and you learn to just continue to work with it because it'll keep popping up, and trauma begets trauma and will lead to more trauma. So it's important to, as you take steps in your life and more trauma kind of finds you, or you become triggered, or like for me, it was my divorce. My parents were divorced when I was younger. I never thought I'd get divorced. That was a big trauma for me, like many people. And so then once I was divorced, it like drudged up all this stuff that subconsciously I had never dealt with about my parents' divorce. And then the shame of being divorced, and just feeling upset that like it happened to me, and like I thought it never would. So once I started doing, getting back into therapy for the divorce, I also started doing self-empowerment. I worked with a company called PSI. They do seminars, and I did their basic seminar. And that was like groundbreaking. And that again focuses on you. It's like before we can talk about any interaction you're having, you have to address you. Like, are you good? Because it's all about how you show up. And I think a lot of the work that they did helped with like victim status, right? Is that a lot of us like to take on this energy of like, well, I've been hurt and I've been harmed. And so we pause and we freeze, and then we make that a reason not to continue to connect with new people. And that was really groundbreaking for me to, just recognize and check myself when I was becoming the victim. And I think I write a lot of Amore from that stance where, it's like, in what way can I shift my mentality every time I think about a relationship to how did I show up to get the result that I got? And, that's been the focus, and what I focus on with students when I was teaching, with you guys in transformation, with my clients in SRT. It was groundbreaking for me because once you unlock that, then you're in the driver's seat, right? You're no longer relying on somebody else to forgive you, or to seek your forgiveness, or to initiate contact, or to help you. It's like, no, you got it. If you can put yourself in the driver's seat, that creates an energy that will automatically attract the energy that you want in others. So, that is the reflection piece. That's what you're reflecting, is whatever you're giving off, you're getting. So
I think that's like super important as a dynamic as a parent. Like I think we just talked about that yesterday too. Like tiny ones are an immediate reflection. Like it doesn't even take a little while for that energy to come back to you. It's like right.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I struggle with that like all the time with Ronan. It's like I'm trying to interact with him, and his immediate response is screaming, and I'm like, what did I do? And then when you look back and reflect on it, you're like, oh, well, you're not necessarily screaming, but if you're coming in with all this energy and you're trying to dictate what they're doing, and they just want to do what they want to do, they're not like, we don't like to be told what to do as adults. So why do we think that they like to be told what to do? But I think that's the dynamic societally that we're ingrained to do, is it's our job to tell them what to do instead of letting them kind of lead themselves, and us just kind of follow along and make sure they just don't hurt themselves or do anything crazy along the way.
Sure.
And that's a huge shift for me. That's hard to make because that's not how I was raised. And that's not, I don't think that's how a lot of us were raised. And, you know, and so it's very eye-opening when a toddler is responding to you in a certain way and you don't really realize it in the moment until afterwards when you reflect and you're like, oh, okay.
Just giving it right back.
There I am.
I could have done that better. We'll try again tomorrow.
You know, it's funny. So when I was at Sci, they have multiple seminars that they do, and the second one is a longer one. I can't really talk too much about it. That's how, you know, the secret society of this program works. But we don't want to ruin anybody's breakthrough, right? So I can't talk too much about it. But I will say that in the second level of this program, I had a conversation with one of the facilitators. He actually was just having it with everybody. And it was like a break in between things, and he wanted to answer questions for parents. And he talked about the first time that he had taken a parenting class through Sci and how hard it was for him to shift away from, you know, teacher and giving and you know, giving an education or giving information versus facilitator and observer, and how that shift for him as a parent was huge. And then like the first time that he recognized it, and like she had fallen asleep in class and ended up being like super embarrassed, and there was this thing with setting her own bedtime, and so that was like the first thing that they had. But I won't go too much into the story, but I can remember like as a teacher, and I only took this course 2 years ago, but as a teacher sitting there and being like, oh my God, if parents knew this, right? If parents could check in with this idea, the amount of, you know, pushback I would get as a teacher, the amount of pushback schools would get, the relationship building that could happen between teacher and parent and administrator and parent would be so different, because it'd be less about control and more about joining in, right? It's more about participating than it is about leading. And, you know, I think the beautiful part about kids is that they don't have these social filters yet of like passive aggressiveness that builds off of, you know, what they've seen for so long and how they've seen it work, and the kind of, hate to use the word, but manipulation tactics that a lot of people use to try to avoid or to try to pacify, because that's what they were taught to do by their parents. That's what they saw to do by their guardians. So, you know, kids are a great gauge, because they will show you exactly what you're giving. There's no like shutting down, you know, there's no putting the filter up and, you know, letting the water seep through. It's like, here's what you're giving me. You're showing up with this here. I'm going to give it back to you. And so it's really beautiful that you're recognizing that with Ronan, because they're worth it. You know, they're the most worth it. And actually part of the reason I didn't pursue coaching adults for a long time was because I really didn't feel that they were worth it. Like I had my own trauma with like can I really help them? Will they really break their you know, structured patterns? Do I have the patience? Was really what the question was for myself. Was like, do I have the patience to like pause and not, you know, like remove myself and become just a conscious observer and a part of their journey like I do for kids. And that's why I didn't, you know, teach adults or coach adults for a long time, is because I thought kids were more worth it, because they are so easy. You don't have to drudge through all of the extra, you know, crap that we learn when we're older.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think you mentioned like manipulation too. And it's funny because like, I think as like adults, we think that kids are like purposely at a young age manipulating us. Like, I know I've said it before. I've been like, there's like no way that he's not purposely doing this, and it's like, but they're not. It's just, they're just genuinely just trying to do whatever they want to do. It's us. It's the manipulation tactics that we've learned and that we do on a regular basis that
absolutely
causes us to think that right off the bat.
Mm-hmm. It's funny how that works, right? How like, and then again, there is that mirroring showing up, right? Like how do you show up to feel like they're manipulating you? Who else has been manipulating you? How have you been manipulating them? How have you been manipulating yourself, right? is always the shifting back. Relationship work is always shifting back and saying, okay, why is this mirroring for me? Right? Like, in what way is this happening to me? In what way am I doing it to me? In what way am I doing it to others that I'm now getting it rebounded to me? It's just, again, radical responsibility for one, right? It's like, okay, how do I show up to get the result I'm getting? Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot to learn in manipulation tactics. I mean, we do it, it's definitely a part of what we're taught to do. And I don't want to get too deep into the emotional side of the relationships right now, I guess, but I think that has to do with the shutting down of the emotion, right? Because the manipulation comes truly because we're trying to shift an emotional response because we're told we shouldn't feel it. I feel sad right now, but I should be happy right now. So let me manipulate my own self. Let me manipulate my own way of being so that I can show up differently for others, because they can't handle me if I show up this way. No one can handle me if I show up this way because my parents couldn't, because I couldn't, because no one taught me how to. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's like internalized at a super young age. Like those that, you know what I mean? Like the reactions in real time, even like at Ronan's age, like he's learning those things now. Like when it's hard for us to handle like a big emotion that he has, then he's learning like, oh, this is too much, or I have to change something because this thing in me causes this effect around me, whether that's he likes it and wants more of it, or he doesn't like it and, you know what I mean, like feels like he needs to change something.
And I think that's generational. That's where generational trauma starts to really set in, because it's not your fault that you don't know how to handle that emotion in him, right? It's you're probably trying to handle the emotion within yourself. It's like, like going to the therapy, doing the transformational mentorship, like doing all these processes is how we unlearn what we were, taught and structured to do by our parents who also had trauma from their parents who had trauma. And so this is where like that line is like, where does it end and how do you break the circle? When they talk about, breaking the circle in psychology, it's hard to do. And I think the biggest thing is recognizing, okay, why is it so hard for me? Again, shifting to me. Why is it so hard for me to handle his emotion right now? Mm-hmm. And just by, and you can even talk with him through that. Like, I'm trying to handle this right now. Like I'm trying to work through this. I'm not sure why it's so hard, but I see you, right? Just seeing him. And like, it's okay. Like, let's work through it together. Let him be a part of your process. Because I think too, we also have been taught that like we have to do everything on our own, which like I've written some papers on like competitive culture and winning and what that looks like, and like suffering, and how like we truly feel that we have to just like suffer to get through things. I won't waste too much time in this podcast on that, but I think that goes back to suffering, where like we feel like we have to suffer on our own, and it's like, no, there's no reason why you can't involve your child in an emotional, in the way that you're handling an emotional experience. By the very act of you involving him in your response to him shows him that he can be supportive and that he can seek support and that that's okay. So the bigger lesson is not, I can't handle it, and so now he picks up and perceives it. Remember, they don't have that filter, so they're not thinking that. They're just looking at you and they're like, oh, okay, mommy's struggling and I'm struggling, but we're doing it together, and we're together in this. That allows that energy of support to be open and that channel to be fluid with him, which is really important for young ones, because they shut down and think that they have to be alone, and that's where we start to get into like, later suicidal tendencies in kids their age, and they're already gonna isolate because of social media. And so it's like, the more we can get them interacting at a young age and feeling supported, the better.
Right. And I think like it's like that suffering alone mentality is like pervasive through everything. Like you're supposed to be perfect and just like this mask of happiness or something for your child. And then beyond that, like in the last episode, we were talking about like the hierarchy of relationships and how like this huge emphasis is put on like single life partner, I'll say. And that relationship being the most important thing, and like everybody waits to meet this one person, and you wait all your entire life for your wedding, and your whole family is waiting your whole life for your wedding, and like, so this culture around that relationship then being everything to you, and that person handling everything, and then within your house you try to keep everything in your house. So if you're having trouble with a parenting issue, or you're having an marital issue, you don't want to tell anybody outside about that, because you're supposed to suffer. And yeah, it's, everything is shameful. And so then this conditioning that we all have cuts us off from a community, which is like what we were all talking about before, I think is what feels more true to us, and like the level of support that you need. Like Lexi is a soulmate of mine. Like, we started in a program of Victoria's together, and like the second the Voxer chat opened, I was like, I have no idea who this human is, but I know her. And
same.
Like
same.
and we're gonna be like, and I've never had a platonic friend like Lexi, who I can show up and not be my best self, and it's okay. And then we are better together because we share all of those things. And then I'm better for D. But like, that's real. Like, that's like, I don't think that's normalized at all to have, and like all other people like that. I mean, or like Coven sisters who you've been knowing for a couple lifetimes, and you have some history together and can support each other in certain ways. But, and then like also how that dynamic could potentially, what we were exploring before, lead to like the divorce rate that we have in this country, and the failure of those single life partner relationships, because there's all of this pressure on that person to be everything.
Sure.
Speaking of,
oh my goodness.
I see him both already.
Right?
It's very hard to have a 3-year-old be independent for a long time.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, you guys are doing great though.
It's all good. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I think,
you know.
yeah. I think that also ties into, like the piece that Ashlee was talking about, and then, even more pervasive within like the overt culture that we have of the suffering. I think like allowing children and allowing small ones to actually see us when we're human, instead of this kind of like, as children, we have this like savior kind of God complex for our parents. We see them as other, we see them as separate, we see them as better. A lot of us, it takes us until we're in our, early, like late teens, sometimes even into, adulthood, that then we're like, oh, wow, yeah, our parents are just people, and they're just like us, and they make mistakes, and they're infallible, and that's okay. And I think having the opportunity to raise children without that kind of filter, without that distorted view of adults specifically, because I don't know about any of you guys, but when I was growing up, I was like, oh yeah, that person's 30 years old, they have everything figured out. And now I'm almost 30 and I'm like, what the fuck? Like, what do you mean? So I think that's like also huge too. And then looking even further into that, like if we have a difference in that kind of cultural mindset, then like how does that change relationships overall? Like not just like parents and children, but like then how does that change the way that we view ourselves within the world and how we interact with other people?
It's funny you bring up the God complex. This is something that is talked about. The first time I heard it was in adolescent psychology when I was getting my bachelor's. And I remember thinking to myself, because for me, I had like they're exactly what they described was like me and my dad. And it was, I found out something about my dad and it shattered, like glass, our relationship. And I still am trying to, and I think we both are trying to like pick up the pieces from that, as crazy as that sounds. And that was, I was like 10 or maybe 12 max. And I'm almost 32 now. So we're looking at, it's taken 10 years to really like reestablish the relationship that we had. which will never be the same, and that's okay. It doesn't need to. But still trying to reestablish that relationship, and that's the person I'm the closest with in my whole life. So that just shows you, for me, how groundbreaking it was, how life altering it was when I had that experience with the God complex. But the God complex, from my understanding, is not something that we can really get rid of, right? Because no matter what you do, and I'll go back to maybe my relationship with my mom, who I had a lot more trauma with in earlier years than my dad, where, you know, as a teenager, it was really easy to just be over my mom. You know, I was like, oh, what the fuck, like, whatever. Like, you know, it got to a point where there was so much letting down that I just stopped expecting. Even that, it took me until about adolescence with that relationship to still not see her as perfect. No matter how many times she hurt me, no matter how many times she didn't show up, she still was perfect. I still wanted to grasp that. So, you know, I think that even if we shift the culture, that's always going to happen naturally because we established love with our parents. And I talk about this a little bit in Amore in one of the pillars, where we just focus on your relationship with your guardians and your primary caregiver, because they are your first experience with love. They're pivotal. And so everything that happens from there is going to impact your future approach to any relationship. But because they're your first love, right? Your parents are the first people you ever love, as weird as that can sound, even intimately in a way for some people, even seeing them be intimate. Because of that, there is no detachment from the God complex. There's no way for it not to happen, because we feel this feeling that we don't feel with anybody else. And we hold it tight because that is source. That's source. We start from love. We start from two people connecting intimately in a way that, you know, in all intents and purposes, is a physical embodiment of love. There's a connection. So because we start from that, we seek it right away. And we will find that being or those beings to be perfect, because they are what brought us there. They are what takes care of us. They are the first show of love for us. It's like the first people that ever show us love are our guardians. Whether that's perfect or not, it's still there. It's the first. And that will, it's like your first love. It's never the same. It's never the same. Why is that? You know? Why is that? So, you know, I think we have a lot of work to do as a society, 1,000%, around suffering and around community. So sweet. But I don't think that will help our God complex. You know, I think it'll just continue to be something that's always there for us. And our parents will always let us down. People will always let us down. That's okay. They're allowed to. They're allowed to. You know, I think more the important piece is, how do we handle when they do? How do we handle when they don't meet our expectation? How do we handle when, you know, they're not perfect for us?
Yeah. I mean, and that's like a huge thing. I know, like, for me personally, that's been a huge thing, is like, how do you not take responsibility for other people? Like, I know that's been a thing that you and I've been working on specifically. And so, like, not feeling responsible for them, and then not feeling responsible for their response to something, and thinking that it's your fault because of that. And
Sure.
And I think that's like, I think it's just another one of those generational things that's just, you know, you got to break the cycle at some point and try to not do that anymore, or not feel that way because of that. So then you don't recreate that cycle.
Sure. That's
for
a hard
your own kids. Yeah.
hard one. You know, savior complex, right? We call it the savior complex. I'm holding on to a sneeze, so I might sneeze on you guys, but I've been like trying to hold it back for a second now. Savior complex is something that, you know, and not to get too spiritual with where I'm going with, you know, this response, but I think that we come in wanting to save the people around us. There's a value to being wanted. There's a value to being needed. Um, I think that even from a young age, like we talked about the God complex, I feel like when God's hurt, right? So like when our parents are sick or when they have a birthday, like we want to be worthy, you know? So it's like, let me bring you soup. And like, you know, you try to take care of your parents. You want to show them love because your understanding of the love is how they take care of you. The real deep connection to love from a parent is when you're hurting, right? So when you're sick, when you're not feeling good, and then they're there for you and you're like, oh my God, the savior, right? So I think naturally we want to save them. And we can't. Lord knows I couldn't save mine. You know, I think we can all agree there's no saving your parents, right? And but we try. But we try when we're younger. And then we try when there's a divorce or when there's a quarrel between them. And then, you know, then I think that it's a really beautiful thing that it comes from, that it stems from, really beautiful energy that the savior complex stems from, because we naturally want to help, right? But then I think it takes on, depending on the codependency of the relationship with parent to child, it can take on that becoming the foundational energy for love. So it's like, I've got to jump to their aid whenever they need me because that's how they tell me that, you know, that I'm caring, right? I know everybody's parents have said at one point or another, you should call your more, like you should call your grandma more, you should call your dad more, you should call your brother more, right? It's like we gotta be told that we're like doing good in the relationship, or we've got to be reminded. It's like when we're reminded like that, that's that savior complex coming in for that person, for you. It's like there's a need to connect, right? There's a need to connect, and the only way to do that is by saving. But really, I mean, all you can do is save yourself. But then even that becomes selfish. So that's a whole nother, you know, there's a whole nother piece of that. But I mean, my opinion quickly on that is that I think that that's the wartime culture that's phasing out with a lot of the older generation. Is, you know, when you're worried that like Hitler's going to come and take over your country, you know, it's like all for one. It's so all for one, and you know, put everything else behind us. But you know, that's our grandparents' age, and so that's what they grew up in, and that's what they, you know, the fear that came from that, and that's why it's like take care of your elders, and you know, make sure you open the door and like be chivalrous, and like chivalry's kind of even like making making a resurgence. I feel like. But that's kind of falling off even, and I think that goes back to that whole generation just fear of war, you know, and so everybody coming together for something that's greater than you, and so you sacrifice, and there's that other vow, right? Suffering and sacrifice. So now sacrifice comes in, and a whole generation of people are taught we got to sacrifice. That's the only way that we can love our country, and it's like, well, okay, and then when we're not in war, how do we sacrifice for our country? How do we handle that? How do we handle the people that come back that don't have to fight anymore? And we haven't really figured that one out, you know? And I think that goes to show why we keep going to war. And I think that goes to show why we keep having these mental health crises, right? And just because we don't know how to not sacrifice ourselves physically. We don't know how to sacrifice emotionally. That's the struggle.
It's interesting because when you were saying that, what popped into my head was like every conversation I think that we had at my parents' house about COVID and my resistance to vaccinate myself, and that was always the argument. Is like, we have to come together and we're all gonna do this as a team, and I was being this like island.
Well, selfish. How dare you?
Selfish island. Right. And
it's a public health crisis, don't you know?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Mm-hmm. And like, and it's interesting because it's like we haven't had that fear, right, of like Hitler showing up in
No, it's all
any
kind
of
of
right. But even that, everything's been away. Like war being here, or like a draft happening, like all of that fear is pretty far removed from us. And
Sure.
so like this pandemic situation is like bringing back, like jacking up that fear again, and bringing. So it's interesting. That's a really interesting perspective. That's what that fosters. That sort of fear fosters that.
Yeah. I mean, selfishness is a hard thing. So starting the conversation, I talked a little bit about like radical self-reliance and radical responsibility for one's self, right? And I think that can sound selfish, right? Like that's like almost the very definition of selfishness. And I think that's why a lot of people, a lot of older people don't deal with what's going on with them. If you think like about your parents, how often do your parents go to the doctor? And I mean, we won't start a conversation on doctors here because I don't go to the doctor. Like how many people, that are older don't refuse to go to a doctor, refuse to put their money into a bank. It's like it's all on them, and they can't talk about it, and they can't share it, and they can't be weak. And I think that's another piece, is like being weak, showing your flaws, saying that you're not okay is not being strong for the country, right? So it's, and then now you look at COVID and it's like, I mean, how much shame was there around getting sick? Like some people couldn't even say that they got COVID because it was like the judgment automatically of like, well, where were you? And you must have been going out and like you must have broken curfew. And it's like, wow, again, we got back into that phase of like, you can't be sick. You can't be bad. You can't be wrong. You can't be anything. It's like, you just got to be home and be perfectly in your lane, right. And that's best for everybody because that's controllable. And I think that, that selfishness, being self-centered, focusing on oneself, whatever term you want to use for it, I think is actually the key and the only way to strengthening the relationships around you. It's like if you're not good with you, if you're not healthy, you can't go out. And then that's the funny part. We say that with COVID, right? It's like, well, if you're not feeling okay, stay home. But we're gonna shame you if you're sick. Like,
yep.
I was gonna say, Lexi, you talked a lot. You talked a lot about that, like in the last episode that we talked about this, as far as like the doing your own, like a lot of negative interactions within relationships, whether they be romantic or familial or whatever, would be so much better if you just figured out your own shit, and then you wouldn't be fighting with the other person all the time. And I know, Lexi, you mentioned that in the last one, and like, but people don't recognize that, and it's hard because I think, like you said, Ashlee, like it's ingrained in us that like it's for the greater good, and self-care is selfish. But I think that thought process is changing now. I think with our generation that it's like we're trying to change that, where it's not selfish, where self-care actually makes you better for everybody else around you. And so I think, I don't know, hopefully that's shifting. But it's hard because even like you said with COVID, it's just like, it's just this constant like finger pointing and like, you're bad, or like, you can't win. You can't do it right. There's no, there's no good
way
way
to get sick the right way, Right. Ooh, sorry, hit the camera, but and I think the conversation shifted. Go ahead, Nate.
And I think even like being vulnerable in front of older generation, like leading by example, like we've been talking about that this week, you and I have, but like we had a conversation. I often explain what I'm going through or what I'm working through with my parents, specifically with my father, because he and I have, he's my closest bond that I have always had. And he and I operate in a very very similar way mentally and emotionally. And we recently had an experience where he, like, in the middle of dinner with Dee and my mom and I, like, broke down crying because he has, like, just feels so much pressure, and he doesn't feel like he can even be who he wants to be or do things that he wants to do because he has to be strong for his family. And I consider my dad to be like a very emotionally literate male. Like, he has always felt to me like that he's been open and that we've had lots of conversations about emotions and feelings, and he's always been super introspective and able to describe how his brain works and how his emotions work, and then in an effort to explain how I might go through things in life. So, like, from the time I was very tiny, he's explained to me that he has a very, what he considers an addictive personality, and he's learned that that can be something like alcohol or drugs, or it can be exercise. And so he never learned to lessen that, the grip that that has on his life, but he learned that he can channel it into exercise or something that's productive and allows you to still be a part of your family and society, versus like alcoholism, which is a very real struggle for him for a while before I was ever born. And so he then, like, saw me and who I am as I was growing up, and in, like, from literally probably like 4 or 5 would tell me this, like, you know what I mean, find something to be positively addicted to. And so we've had all these sorts of conversations my whole life, and so it was wild to me to see how much he's suppressing all the time because of this societal need to be strong. And like the especially on men, I think, is like this, like, to be strong for your family and provide for your family, which I think is a little bit older generation than ours, but it still manifests today. I mean, even like when my brother and I have been at odds about something, or I've disagreed with my brother about something in front of my dad, he will quickly jump to his defense and say, well, he is under stress because he has to provide for his family and he has to do this and he has to be everything for all of these people. And so it's just like that mindset is so pervasive and so ingrained, and then it leads to you limiting yourself and never again, like, my dad can't, like, as I'm learning to care for myself and to make myself a priority, I can see that he can't do that at all. I'm like, you know, to the point of, I channeled this whole energy healing for his hips. He's already had a hip replacement at 50. He's long distance runner. Anyway, I channeled all this stuff for his hips, and the first assignment I gave him was a stretching routine, which is literally 10 minutes of stretching a day. And he's had that downloaded on his phone for 2 months, and he can't. He texts me about it. He checks in, and he said, "I'm sorry, but I can't. I haven't even gotten to it yet." And that's like 10 minutes a day. He can't take 10 minutes a day to stretch because it's so uncomfortable. When you get to, I mean, it's uncomfortable for us, but I can only imagine, you know, like 20 years down the road, you know.
I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot. let me start with, so trigger word for me, addiction, right? My mom's an alcoholic. She's gone through the 12 steps. She's fallen off the wagon since. Still love her all the same. Something that I felt like was passed to me, that I have not received any like addiction therapy for, but that I know I struggle with certain things. I mean, I smoke nicotine, you know, on a vape constantly. I'm surprised I've gone this long while I'm talking to y'all. But with addiction, right? And because I have dealt with it so intimately for my whole life. I mean, since I was born, with my mom, and actually probably partially with my dad, there is the belief that like you can replace it. And I think that can be toxic. And I think that a lot of people who have successfully gotten off of drugs and alcohol will replace with cigarettes. A lot of them. That's like one of the first things is like if you see AA meetings, they're just like, you know, puffing away, puffing away, puffing away. A lot of them will replace with music or God or religion. And so a lot of people become very religious. And that still is a supplemental shift. And as I'm saying this, it's 222 my time here. Sorry, I just got my eye. I have my own opinions on that shift because I think honestly that addiction is never gonna leave the body until the source of the addiction is dealt with. And the addiction is not, in my opinion, addiction is not what is the like what needs to be treated. It's the source that is causing the addictive nature to pacify and to numb. So like for me, it comes down to worth, and it's like that for a lot of people. But for me in my own therapy, it was self-worth. And it was like, okay, why am I self-sabotaging? Because that's that's what happens with addicts, right? I know I don't want to. I can admit I don't want to. I really am trying not to. And then all of a sudden I fall back into it. And when I fall back into it, I do it a lot. I do it a lot. I do it a lot. And then I just don't care. And then that cycle happens over and over again where then the shame comes in. And then you stop, and then you see them struggle, and then they fall into it harder again, and that's what we call relapsing. So with addiction, again, I go back to radical self-reliance because if the focus wasn't on the problem, right? If the focus wasn't on the addiction, because really the addiction doesn't hurt anybody but the people around the addict. The addict is not effective. The addict is happy go fucking lucky. They can shoot up and do whatever the fuck they want and continue to get high. So this isn't about the addict. This becomes about the people around the addict that can't handle the addict. That's really what it comes down to. Because like for my mom, I can tell you, she was a functioning alcoholic. My mom can go to work and not be drunk at work, but then she'll come home and crush 30 beers. So the problem there is, how does the addict connect emotionally and intimately with the people that they need as a system to help them be a better human? Because we all need connection. We are social beings. And I think that because of that, like a lot of people will like, you know, go and do these interventions and send them off to rehab. And it's like, because you think that the problem is the alcohol. And it's like, no, the problem is really that they can't fucking relate to anybody. For some reason, they can't relate to you. They don't feel that they can connect with you. They don't feel that you understand. Why is that? Where did that stem from? And that therapy is different. And I think a lot of therapists, because of the, you know, lawsuits and things like that, and again, just my opinion, but, you know, a lot of therapists that when they hear somebody say use, if they hear somebody talk about use, it's automatically you need addiction therapy. And that's how insurances run. And so they just push these people into addiction therapy, even though the person could really use the fucking therapist for something else. So that's what I want to say about addiction. Now, and I think it relates to with people in our parents' generation bottling up emotion, right? I believe that that's part of what leads to like all these big shifts with like Alzheimer's and dementia that seem to be happening more and more for the older generation, is that they're just bottled up emotions that they've never dealt with and they don't know how to get out. And so these outbursts, you know, when older people become ornery and like you can't be around them, it's like they're just fucking angry. They've been fucking angry their whole life, but they have no one to talk about it, especially females, right? It's like you find these old ornery women who lost their husband and never marry again and like don't go out of the house, and like the aunts, the crazy aunts, you know, that just like no one wants to be around. It's like, why is that? And it's no one fucking supported them. No one talked to them as a female about how to deal with the fact that they didn't want a man and felt that they could be an individual, and they grew up in a society where no one talked like that. That wasn't okay. You had to have a man to be successful, and you had to have a partner, and you know, then this leads into the conversation of you talking about finding one person and marrying them. right? Again, radical self-reliance is the only way to get to shift out of that mindset. Is I'm not with somebody to fulfill me. I am with somebody because it's the icing on the cake. Because I think that they deserve to be in my presence. Because I think that they're fun to be around and I want to be around them more than anybody. And I'm also sexually attracted to them. It's not that I need them. I don't need them. I need me. But again, I think that it all relates, right? It's like we have this bottling up that's taught to us through lineage that goes back to not being selfish. We bottle up these emotions and then we put our value on somebody else, right? I can't deal with myself, so how about I just find somebody else to fix? Goes back to being a savior. We try to fix this other person. That becomes our life's work. Is like fixing our husband or wife, and like because we can't do it with our parents anymore. And so we do that, and then we continue to bottle our emotions and not talk about them with each other, which leads to the massive amounts of addiction in this nation. And people killing bottles of wine every night like it's nothing. And that becoming the relationship. And then at the end of it all comes the dementia and the Alzheimer's and the ornery nature of losing somebody. And then we still can't connect with our kids because it was never fucking about our kids. It was always about us trying to save our significant other because we couldn't talk about or deal with ourselves. So we placed our love and our value in that other person. Mm-hmm. And then the cycle fucking continues. So I think, again, going back to fucking everybody pause for a second and say, okay, and even you, and I've talked to you both about, why are you in your relationship? Are you in your relationship to save each other? Are you in your relationship to save yourself? Are you in your relationship because you complement each other? Do you need each other? Do you want each other? What's that look like? Because like for me with my boyfriend, I know, he is just the icing on the cake. But I could find another one of him anytime I want to. That's the piece. And he's aware of that. And I told him. He's like, hey, I want you. I love you. Because when you can't say that, when you can't have that conversation and say, I think in my mind right now, you're the only one for me. I believe that. I do. I love you. I don't want anybody else. But if I don't all of a sudden want you anymore, if something doesn't work out, trust me, I'll find another one. That's because I know I'm good within me, because I can trust myself to say, I'm not happy here, so I step away. And I trust myself to then say, I stepped away, and because of that, I'm in my power, and I know that within my power, I can attract another mate if I want one, or if I need one. Mm-hmm. It's all about you.
Exactly.